I would like to introduce Dr. Ahmed Naji. He's an independent researcher, cultural advisor, specializing in modern and contemporary Iraqi art. Dr. Ahmed focuses on research and documentation of public art, museum and private collections. His book, Under the Palm Trees, Modern Iraqi Art with Muhammad Makiya and Jawad Salim, has been published already in New York. Is that right?
May, actually.
In May. Okay, so it's going to be due to be released in May. Now, you probably be surprised, Dr. Ahmed is a dentist. What is he doing with art? I don't know. There's a story behind it. You need to follow our Facebook page and see our event with Dr. Ahmed. When I asked him this question, I said to him, you're a dentist, what are you doing with art? And he gave us the answer, so please follow our Facebook page. So Dr. Ahmed has graduated from the College of Dentistry in Baghdad University, gained his master's degree in dental implantology in the UK. I had to practice this so much, not to make any mistake. And currently doing his PhD. The floor is yours, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this evening. And obviously, thank you to Niran and Daya for making this event possible. Niran has been working tirelessly to put this event together. It's been a year in the making.
Exactly a year.
Exactly 1 year. Yes, so please, another round of applause to Niran and Daya. So, as Niran alluded earlier, that yes, I am a dentist. This is what I do Monday to Friday in the morning. And then in terms of art research, that's what I do Monday to Friday in the evening, Saturday and most of Sunday. And the reason for me is that art is one of the ways where I can understand my identity and I can understand my history and reinvestigate this history in a different narrative. We grew up in Iraq during a time when history and all the context of that history was constructed with different layers of propaganda, where everything that we see actually has different meanings and every symbol has a different type of expression that has been greatly influenced by the Ba'ath regime and the way that we grew up. I was born in 1983. My earliest memories of that time is that me sitting in my father's lap holding an AK-47, shooting some rounds to celebrate the end of the Iraq-Iran war. Everything I remember from that time onwards, in a way, goes back to Saddam Hussein, whether I like it or not. The only escapism that I had was with Iraqi art through Jawad Salim, Shakir Hassan, and the different voices that we started to see later on. But obviously many of you know that even Iraqi art itself has suffered from that, let's say, censorship and the influence of propaganda. Then in 2010, that's when the first time I heard of Michael Rakowitz, and it was by complete coincidence. I was in Tate Modern, I walked into this room, and then I saw the Crossroads Monument, and I said, I did a double take. And then I read the name again. I haven't heard of this artist before. Let me pick up a leaflet and read about it. And the reason why I did a double take, because what Michael was doing in that exhibition is that he was taking a topic that is almost, at the time, especially for Iraqis, was a taboo. And he was taking a demon that is Saddam Hussein and he was humanizing him. He was dissecting his narrative in a different way without passing judgment on him, because judgment has already been passed, it's already the war. But he was looking at it almost in a way that any young people in Iraq were trying to think about it, but they did not have access to all the information or all the storytelling techniques that Michael has had because of his training and living in the United States. So in one way, thinking that if Michael grew up in Iraq, he wouldn't have been able to come up with this kind of narrative to discuss it. But because he wasn't, although he is Iraqi, is it 50% or yes? more than 50%, 60. He has a very legitimate voice, and there is some sort of genuine interest in the topic, rather than being like other artists who looked at Iraq, but they were remote from the topic. So in this exhibition, Michael and I are going to break our necks, and we're going to sue Iran for it. Is the worst condition is to pass under a sword which is not one's own. And this is a famous quote of Saddam Hussein, everyone is familiar with it, from the 1980s. We studied it in our history books in school in the 1990s. And obviously, it's related to the Crossroads Monument in Iraq, which everyone is familiar with. As a child, our family, every Friday evening and in the weekend, we used to go to the ceremonial parade grounds because it's the largest, nice open field that's flooded with lights, and you can have your watermelons and a different type of food, etc., and you can play football. And I used to play football, and I come close to the Crossroads Monument, and I didn't know what it was. I was 6 years old, 7 years old at the time. And at the base of these concrete, there is a whole relief in metal, which is the saying of Saddam Hussein, and then his signature at the bottom. So you feel that you are so close to this dictator, that you're so close to his name and signature. You can touch it, it's right there. And it's a weird feeling, because you are growing up in a sense that you can't say anything about the president, you can't mention him, it has to be in favorable terms. And the plot thickens that throughout school, because of my father as an artist, my great uncle was Shakir Hassan al-Zaid, who's a well-known artist. And I like painting and art as well, but my mother doesn't like it because she doesn't like my father. What I had to do is that I had to create a legitimate reason to practice art in school. And I was, convincing my mom that it can help with my grades, and it certainly did, because of, teachers. They would come to me and say, "You paint, you do well. Why don't you do for a poster for us something?" And obviously, all posters has to do something with Saddam Hussein. So I had to develop a quick technique to do a portrait of Saddam Hussein without getting him cross-eyed or getting one of the eyes bigger than the other. And the easiest way was to do basically the square technique to magnify it and then stick Ray-Bans on him. So I saved time in drawing the eyes. Now, the Crossroad, the ceremonial parade grounds, obviously it is famous for, we can turn this around if you want. It is famous for all the military marching, because this is the main reason.
المقاتل الفريق الاخر يعطي فريق المهني هذا القطعات والاستعراض لداعي الاقصى القطعات قاعد التنفيذ ايدي.
Okay. So this is the official function of the ceremonial parade ground. It's where the leader shows off his power. But in that particular year, 2000, we, as in Iraqis, were defeated in the Second Gulf War. We were still dragging, let's say, our wounds from the Iraq-Iran War of 8 years. We were suffering from sanctions. And in that year, the 2000, Saddam had to reinvent, let's say, a cause for the marches and the display of power. And it was through the Yom al-Nahwa and Nida al-Quds, basically the call to liberate Jerusalem. It's this old Arab, narrative, nationalism that came alive. And in that particular year, I finished my study in high school. And my future was dangled in front of me, saying that if you do not participate in the marches, or marching in the ceremonial parade ground with the other volunteers to liberate Jerusalem, then we can't guarantee that you'll go to university and get what you want. And this wasn't only me. This was basically the norm for thousands and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis at the time. So having that knowledge in mind, I wanted to appreciate that obviously not everyone marching of these soldiers is actually believing what they're doing. They're doing this as part of, just normalizing, getting on with it. Just like stopping for a red traffic light, which we in Iraq rarely do. But, it's just part of the system. So this, in a sense, it creates a very complex narrative, as in, when you do something that the government wants you to do, you're not supporting it, but at the same time, you don't really have a chance of condoning it. And this is when you become complicit in a full circle. You're immersed in an environment where you are Ba'athist, even if you do not involve in Ba'ath. And this was the same. كل العراقيين بعثيون وإن لم ينتموا. So you are a member of the Ba'ath Party, even if you are not a member of the Ba'ath Party. So artists, writers, poets, etc., we cannot pass judgment and say they were supporting the regime 100%. And this is the point where I think that restudying that history, re-examining it, rather than just painting it with a very wide brush, is very important. It's very important for the people who are born in the 80s, who are born in the 90s, and onwards. So, with Saddam Hussein and the ceremonial parade grounds, obviously we know his obsession with the different ways that he can interpret power or display power, whether it's through the Islamic heritage of being the knights and the sword and all of that things, or it's with the pushing the different engineers in Iraq to build different types of missiles during the sanctions, and you have that, it's very interesting to have a portrait behind your throne. This is from Saddam's palace of Iraqi missiles. It's a very interesting choice of art and where you're placing it. And then obviously the way that he portrays himself. So he is, at that time, talking, his rhetoric is everything against the West. But his attire and his old style is completely Western. And the shotgun that he's holding in his hand becomes a symbol. This particular image of Saddam, in terms of his coat and the shotgun, becomes one of the most replicated image that you see outside every government building in Iraq, because it's so easy to do, and from an artistic point of view, it's the easiest cliche and copy. So years go forward, 2003, everything changes. The world that I know of Saddam Hussein disappears, and I frantically try to grasp an understanding of my identity. And I would work, I had the opportunity to work at the Iraq Memory Foundation with Kanan Makir. And one of the main points, or let's say projects of the Memory Foundation, was to use the same ceremonial parade grounds as a museum and a site for remembrance, and to keep the cross-swords monuments, which I was, a year later, this is the book of Kanan Makir on the monument, which in 2006 or 7, I was passing by the monument and I see there were cranes trying to dismantle this monument, which was started by Khalid al-Rahal, and then Khalid al-Rahal passed away, and then it was completed by Mohammed Ghani Hikmet. As we know that the hands were based on a cast of Saddam's hands that was magnified. The blade of the sword itself was made from thousands of melted guns that were used in the Iraq-Iran War, and it's full of symbols. So the hilt of the sword at the bottom, it has a replica of Nasb al-Shahid, the martyr's monument that you can see there. And then from each of the hands, you have that net. It's a bronze net, and it has thousands of the helmets of Iranian soldiers. And I'm sure a lot of you know this story already. And these were carried across the field of the Iraq-Iran war, thousands of miles, to be brought and put here to recreate the idea or the heritage that the Assyrians started when they killed their enemies, they piled their heads. And then we also have the Mongols who, they invaded Baghdad and they killed hundreds of Baghdadis, and they did towers of their heads in what's known as the, I read in one of the books, basically the Kallachiyya. Kallachiyya is related to Kalla Pacha, or it's the same area where Timur Lenk had these towers of heads of Baghdadis. And Kallachiyya is like the red district in Baghdad. That's where you find all the prostitutes and stuff. So there is some level of decadence, and it's linked all the way through with this symbolism that these artists were doing. Now, that monument, according to Kanaan Makiya and to different narrations of how Iraqi art was seen, is considered as kitsch, as in it is the type of art which does not really relate to the ethos of art in terms of genuinity, creating new ideas, inspiring people. And this very end of Iraqi art becomes one of the main points that Michael Rakowitz started. So after this long introduction, I have to, I'm really sorry, but you have to set the context in the right way. So Iraqi art ending with kitsch, and you starting your work with kitsch. How did you manage to do that?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, Al-Tara and Paul Collins and to you for being here. And this was magnificent to watch you think through, and also hear you speak about it as somebody who grew up during that period of time and wanted to be an artist and ended up a dentist. I somehow avoided being a doctor, like my dad, but we'll still take you, in terms of beginning with kitsch, I mean, kitsch is one of those words an artist never wants to hear their art affiliated with. But at the same time, I think that there's something about the everyday that is embedded in this word kitsch. But I think that in some ways, the way one of the ways in which kitsch is seen through a lens, an art historical lens, is that's a decidedly Western lens. It's a canon that comes out of people who are participating in making up the terms, whether it's Clement Greenberg or somebody else. It's usually through this lens of the West looking elsewhere. So my own embracement of kitsch is one that I also see as a kind of act of resistance, as one that is looking to not be colonized, to not be colonial, to not fall in line with this idea that everything needs to be somehow restrained and aloof and abstracted.
There's actually something to be said for the ways in which we tell our stories. We can go back to what you were talking about, Paul, with this idea of storytelling coming into the frame. When we talk about Iraqi art, whether it's looking at antiquity or looking at modernity. And I feel that those kinds of aesthetics that accompany those kinds of artwork that comes from the people in each of those places is something that is due a bit more respect than just referring to it as kitsch. And this was one of those things that when I read Kanaan Makiya's book, The Monument, back when he was actually not Kanaan Makiya, he was calling himself Samir al-Khalil, because of fear of retribution. The one troubling part of the book that I think it's a fantastic book, but he does actually deconstruct the Iraq's monuments by using Clement Greenberg's arguments about what high art is and what kitsch is. And I think that there's a problem there, in that it starts to kind of really bring these kind of values and views of the colonial into the space of the indigenous.
And even though that indigenous work is being made to kind of worship a dictator, you know, one can't discount the importance of some of those works of art. And I think specifically, you know, one of the big tragedies for me in looking at what happened with Iraqi monuments in the aftermath of the Iraq War in 2003 was what happened to the memorial in Basra on the Corniche. I think it's 80 different sculptures of people who died during the war.
Yes, of the Iraqi generals and soldiers who were pointing across the Shatt al-Arab to Iran.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was made by the Sculptors Collective in Baghdad, and it was a work, you know, this was a work where all these sculptors got together with the Polaroids of the men who were killed, you know, from the families and whatever else. And then when the British were occupying Basra, they took those sculptures down. And for me, those moments of erasure, you know, there's reasons why, the ways in which people start to kind of justify those erasures, whether it's de-Baathification or it's the people reacting against Saddam, it also gets coupled in with people saying, well, it was such bad work anyway, or it was bad taste anyway. And I'm always wondering whose taste, right? And so, so that's the first part of my messy answer to this question. But the other thing that you're mentioning about kitsch, about the pre-existing, as an artist, I was educated in a Western art college, and one of the most exciting people you can ever study is Marcel Duchamp, you know, who was capable of doing things like revolutionizing the field by putting a urinal inside a gallery, right? And it was always about enlisting these things that were ready-made. And so if I'm thinking about the Lamassu, for instance, as something that came before me, you know, somebody already made that. And it's the hands of these incredible artisans, you know, from antiquity in Assyria, and we'll never know their names. And what a shame that is, right? But in being able to kind of say that it was maybe not ready-made, but it had already appeared, it disappeared. So what I'm interested in is not necessarily what people call reconstruction or replica. I'm interested in reappearance, because the only way that those things can come back right now is as ghosts. And that a ghost really does need to wear something different if it's going to haunt you. It can't look the same way as it did in real life. And then the other thing is to recognize the fact that all of those artifacts, you know, used to be painted, and they emerged from the earth, you know, whether it was in Greece or it was in the grounds where ancient Assyria was. It emerged from the earth with like a palette that was more, you know, consumable for the West, where it was white if it was marble, or it was just, you know, yeah, gypsum. Without the colors. And I think the colors are important because the colors also show a certain kind of desire in the work and how it was presented. So that's one of the reasons why I think about starting with kitsch when I'm not, you know, like, I mean, really, it's like it gives me nightmares. I'm going to have nightmares tonight about whether or not I'm a kitsch artist. But if I also think about this project that you've shown about Saddam and about his fascination with science fiction, well, you know, he collected those paintings by Rowena Morrill, who was a US-based science fiction illustrator. And everybody made fun of Saddam for that, you know, in the aftermath of the US invasion, finding these paintings of these scantily clad women being attacked by dragons, you know, but the person who taught Rowena Morrill to paint that was the same person who painted the poster for Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. And that's what I grew up with. I mean, that was my Gilgamesh, you know, was Star Wars, right? And so this, for me, was, you know, part of the kind of cosmology, the Dionysian storytelling, and everything that is part of this kind of continued tradition of what it means to
to be ethical, to resist those who are unethical, and to then have some kind of enlightenment. And maybe Saddam saw himself that way. I mean, many Iraqis did not see him that way, and certainly the West painted him as the villain. But what I was interested in were those moments where, you know, there were these weird things happening, where you pointed out the monuments, but then also the helmets that were used by the Fedayeen Saddam were directly cast from a Darth Vader helmet. And so actually, you know, finding that on eBay, yeah, this is a helmet from the Fedayeen Saddam. This is actually something that I found on eBay. I started looking at eBay as a way to learn about Iraq, because so much of Iraq has ended up on eBay. After the looting of the Iraq Museum, those antiquities ended up on places like, yes, Christie's or Sotheby's, but some of it ended up on eBay. And so pretty soon, those antiquities were not available on eBay anymore because they would shut down the auctions. But then I was interested in what Iraq didn't want back, or what nobody else was caring about. And it was like the war trophy that was brought back by the US soldier. And so this Fedayeen Saddam helmet, which looks exactly like Darth Vader's helmet, it turns out that when the soldier who was in the 101st Airborne Division in Mosul asked the locals, like, what is this? This looks like Darth Vader. And they said, yes, Saddam and Uday were huge Star Wars fans. You know, and that in the aftermath of the first war, the first Gulf War in 1991, they said, well, I guess we're the bad guys now. You know, we're no longer part of the rebel alliance, you know, because Iraq was the proto-ally for the US in fighting Iran. And in 1998, when they had to redesign the uniforms of the Fedayeen Saddam, Uday said, well, let's wear the uniform, you know. And it was this really weird kind of moment where you recognize that these are not just symbols for the West. They're watching the same movies, you know, and we always other them, you know. And when you start to recognize the fact that, like, Uday Hussein may have been playing the same games in his father's backyard as I was on Long Island, you know, it becomes something that's not necessarily just about humanizing, but actually opening up a real space where we can all recognize that we're looking at the same things, and that we're looking at those same, like, monoliths that tell us about power and what is right and what is wrong, and we're all reading it differently. It's like a reversal of the Tower of Babel.
Wow. Yes.
Sorry, long answer.
Yes,
Yeah.
Obviously, the biggest project that you saw was not the first time. First thing that you did with Iraq, I think your first was enemy kitchen in 2003. And this is where you learned different types of recipes from your mom, and you were recreating them, and you were teaching school children to cook them, but then you brought back van.
Yep.
Yes. And you had the Iraqi refugees and Iraqi veterans, US veterans who served in Iraq to come and cook for you.
It's such a brilliant idea. And obviously, we Iraqis, we revolve around food. And we have the famous saying that the shortest way to a man's heart is his stomach. And I see this, you know, amazing scene. But I have some questions for you. So one of the first questions is that obviously there is a lot of thoughtful design in terms of the color of the van and the use of the shi'ar, the emblem of the Republic. What was people's reaction to that? And obviously you made it very clear to them as in enemy's kitchen. So you were provoking them. But how was it in terms of, like, the day-to-day with Americans?
Well, Americans are weird. You know, there was moments when people would come to it and immediately just see the Arabic, and that was it. An American can't read that, you know, but they see the Arabic. So, you know, we couldn't get anybody to insure the food truck. Every insurance company in Chicago would look at the picture of the truck and they'd be like, no, absolutely not. They just look, and then it was State Farm Insurance in Chinatown that finally gave us, our insurance. And the color, the interesting thing about the color is that this is the color that was actually used. This is the green that my grandfather used for his company in Baghdad. So it's from Davison's and Company. And so I've always, this green is like a continuation. It's like a memorial to my grandfather, and keeping that business alive as a form of memorial. But of course, when you put it on an ice cream truck from 1976, it ends up looking like a military vehicle. So it's an interesting duality for me, but because Iraq has only ever been seen through the filter of militarism, and also through the filter of green-tinted CNN images, the night vision blowing up Iraq, it seemed like the right kind of place to enter into a conversation about comfort and discomfort and hospitality and hostility, and to open up a space where those two things could be discussed. And what's interesting about hospitality is the word comes from the root auspice, which relates to ostis, and that's where it means guest, but it also means stranger or enemy. This is where the term not only host comes from, but also hostage and hostility. And so I was interested in those moments, like in Iraqi cooking, you have hamud helu, sweet and sour. And the idea is that the sweet and sour is meant to hold things in a space of tension for the tongue, yeah? So like if you make a kubba and you make a kubba hamud, you want your stew, the marak, to be helu, yeah, right. So I was interested in having those moments that are not only about the generosity and the cooking, but realizing the fact that you cannot talk about Iraq and the United States without it being immediately dehumanized by the way in which it's seen through the lens of war, through the lens of oil, and through a very racist kind of lens when it comes to the Middle East. And so this was a way for me to work with my mother. First of all, it's a collaboration with my mother. And she started this all really in 1991. And we were watching the war unfold on television. And she realized that this was the first time my brothers and I were seeing Iraq in real time. We had always heard about these amazing stories through our grandparents about how much they loved Baghdad and amazing stories. And then, for her to see us watching it being introduced to us with explosions, she immediately drew our attention away from the television and said, there are no Iraqi restaurants in New York. And it was like the most mysterious thing for her to have said at that moment. But later on I realized what she meant, that Iraqi culture was not available or visible to us beyond oil and war, and maybe the antiquities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that was really something. And at that moment I realized I'd probably be working for the rest of my life trying to save my grandmother's stories. And so, when my mother and I started to teach the different groups of people in New York, the kids whose parents were in the war but they weren't allowed to talk about it in school, I moved to Chicago a few years after we began it. And Chicago actually has Iraqi restaurants, but they call themselves Mediterranean, And so I wanted to work with a restaurant to start this food truck, because you need to have a host kitchen in Chicago. And I worked with this place that is called Milo's Pita Place, and they're young refugees who came from Shaklawa. And they became so famous for the food truck that they closed Milo's Pita Place and they opened up Milo's Palace. So the food truck actually became a nightclub. And now they've come out of the closet a little bit more. So Milo's Palace was renamed Babylon Bistro. And so if you go there on Fridays and Saturdays, you listen to Iraqi singers. And they don't have time to bring out the food truck much anymore. And so it's a project that has allowed it to evolve into something else. Yeah.
One of the elements that you use here, I'm looking at your work now with an Iraqi lens rather than an American lens, and I see that you created your own flag. And obviously, it's a very interesting variation on the Iraqi flag, because as we know, that one is from the 1963, and that is the third iteration of the Iraqi flag in the history of the Iraqi state, which is known as the Ba'athist flag. And then in 1991, it was they added Allahu Akbar, which is written in Saddam's handwriting, yes, to it. Then after the 2003 war, the governing council changed that because they wanted to come to some sort of consensus about the Iraqi flag. So they thought they have to keep Allahu Akbar because of the Islamic, heritage and symbolism, but changed it to Kufi. And then finally, but that flag, one of the stars, was not raised in Kurdistan because Mr. Barzani had issues with the stars. So they had to come to another variation, which is to remove the stars and keep Allahu Akbar. And there are lots of stories and analysis about it. But then you come and you add a fourth star, and you change it from a 5-pointed star to a 6-pointed star, which obviously in Iraq is, like if anyone sees you with a 6-pointed star, then you're hanging. Yeah.
Well, this I didn't know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No. So yes, you tell us about how did you create this flag?
The Chicago flag, but just in Iraqi colors. So those stars are usually just in red, and those lines are in like light blue. It's supposed to, there's different symbols that it's relating to, but I just thought, oh, this is the best. I'm working with the Chicago Iraqi community. And so the Chicago Iraqi refugee community has kind of adopted this as an unofficial flag. But it was used for Enemy Kitchen as a way of just making it, a blend of Chicago and Iraq. But yeah, sorry about the 6-pointed star, but that's a Chicago thing,
Yes. Okay, so the last question. Obviously, this is your ongoing project from 2007 onwards. And you're continuing to recreate these about 5,000 pieces or so that were lost from the museum. And it's interesting when you put that in contrast to Iraqi art, where they started with modernism, and then they went back to their heritage to create, appropriating heritage, obviously, Dawasini, and they ended up with the Freedom Monument. Yeah. So you're almost doing like a full circle for you, that you started with kitsch. I hope your nightmares are not going to happen tonight. And you're ending up with heritage. So it's like the complete reversal of the Iraqi art journey. So where are you going next with this? What's your next journey? And with this question,
Thank you. This is, we really got to get you into the art field officially. This is wonderful. This is like the most gentle pulling out of my teeth. The directions are always multifold for me. Like I'm always thinking about different things simultaneously. I have an exhibition that's opening up at Whitechapel in June. It's going to be a survey exhibition of like 20 years worth of work, and it will bring us right up until last June, when I started to reconstruct the different palace rooms that were from the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, and that were destroyed by Daesh in 2015. And there's a new film there that's also going to be there, that also deals with Iraq heritage and veterans. But I'm becoming more and more interested in excavations and what it would mean for teams of Iraqi archaeologists to collaborate with Native American archaeologists in places like the Southwest, and to start to discuss what it would mean to kind of have an encyclopedic museum in Iraq that is not necessarily looking at the artifacts of empire, but looking at the artifacts of the people that were conquered. and what it would mean to set up dialogues where it wasn't just simply about extraction of materials from one place to another, but genuine exchange because of genuine curiosity. And so I'm interested in setting up something with First Nations archaeologists and Iraqi archaeologists, and then seeing
And British archaeologists.
yeah, maybe, yeah, you know, but you know that kind of relationship that that can be investigated. And I think that art is a good place to start when it comes to projects like this, because if you mention it in an academic sense, it's kind of impossible. And so so that's where my head is now.
Amazing. Can you please remind us again of your exhibition at Whitechapel? When is it going to open?
I believe it opens officially, the public opening is June 7th, and it's up until August 25th.
Okay, on this note, I would thank you very much.
Thank you
so
so
much.